The gate closed, not with violence, not with fire, with the particular finality of something that had never needed to close before. In a world where nothing had ever been withheld, closing for the first time and making a sound that neither of the two people standing on the other side of it had any category for. Because there had been no gates before, and there had been no closing before, and there had never been a reason for either. Two people stood on the other side of that sound. The ground beneath their feet was the same ground. The sky above them carried the same light it had always carried. The air held the same temperature it had held a moment before. On the other side of the boundary they had just crossed without fully understanding that they were crossing it. But something in the quality of all of it had shifted. The way a room shifts when someone you love has just left it, when the chair is still warm, and the warmth means something different now. They had never heard silence like this before. In the garden, silence had been full, the silence of something present, something attending to them, something that knew their names and used them. This silence was different. This silence was just silence. The absence of sound rather than the presence of something larger than sound. And the difference between those two kinds of silence was not small. It was everything. What you are about to hear tonight comes from a text most people have never encountered. It is called the Apocalypse of Moses, and in its Latin form, the life of Adam and Eve. It is not scripture in the way Genesis is scripture. It does not sit inside the Bible most people in the Western world grew up reading. It is something older in feeling, stranger, and more willing to linger over what the story costs. Tonight we follow what this ancient family of stories imagined happening next. Not as history, not as doctrine, as the question that generations of readers could not stop asking. What happened after the gate closed? Let that question settle into you. Let the weight of today begin to move down and out. There is nowhere left to be tonight. There is only this, the gate, and the two people standing outside it, learning, for the first time, what it means to be somewhere they were not made for. The story is already beginning. Imagine one of those rooms. No windows. A single candle burning low on a wooden table worn smooth from years of use. A man bent over a sheet of prepared animal skin, his pen moving slowly and deliberately across it, copying words in a language that was not his own, in a place the original writer never imagined. For readers the original writer never knew would exist. Outside that room, a city moves through its ordinary day. Markets opening, children calling to each other across the narrow streets, the particular noise of a world that has somewhere to be and things to do. Inside the room, the only thing happening is this: the slow and deliberate transfer of words from one surface to another, the careful work of keeping something alive by writing it down again. He had a choice about what to copy. Every scribe did. The animal skin had to be prepared before a single word could be placed on it. The ink had to be mixed. The candle would burn through the night if he stayed that long. There were other texts available to him. More official texts. Texts with institutional endorsement and the backing of people in positions of authority who had already decided these were worth the cost of preserving. He chose this one, not because a council had voted for it, not because a bishop had endorsed it or an institution had funded the work, because this text was answering something he could not find answered anywhere else. Something about what it costs to live outside the place you were made for. Something he recognized. In the quiet of that room, with the candle burning low, as true, in a way that the other texts, for all their authority, had not answered this particular question for him in quite the same way. That is how this text survived, not through official channels, not through the decisions of powerful people in important rooms determining what was worth keeping, through ordinary readers, across 20 centuries. deciding again and again that this particular story was worth the cost of keeping. They copied it in Greek. They copied it in Latin. They carried it into Armenian and Slavonic and Ethiopic. Each translation a separate act of preservation by people who had never met each other and never compared notes, all arriving independently at the same quiet conclusion. This story matters. Write it down again. The text we are following tonight goes by more than one name, which is itself a clue to its nature. In Greek manuscripts, it appears most often as the Apocalypse of Moses. In Latin manuscripts, it becomes the life of Adam and Eve. In Armenian and Slavonic versions, the details shift. Certain scenes appear that do not appear elsewhere. Certain scenes disappear. Emphases change in ways that reflect the communities doing the copying and the specific questions those communities were bringing to the material when they sat down to copy it again. What scholars who work with these manuscripts are careful to say is that we are not dealing with a single unified document, with a single original author and a traceable original we could locate and verify. If we looked hard enough, we are dealing with a family of texts, a cluster of related traditions that share a common concern and a common set of central scenes, even as they differ from each other in details that matter. Not every version agrees on every detail. None of it carries the authority of Genesis. But somewhere within this family of manuscripts, in one or more of its surviving versions, someone thought these things were true enough to write down and pass forward. And that act of passing forward continued across 20 centuries until it arrived here, in this room, tonight. That common concern, the thread that ties all of these versions together across all of their differences, is a single question that Genesis raises and does not answer. What happened to Adam and Eve after they left the garden? Genesis was not written to linger. It moves with deliberate velocity, covering centuries in paragraphs, lives in sentences, entire generations in a single verse. It tells us they were sent out. It tells us they had children. It tells us Adam lived for 930 years, a number so large it is almost impossible to hold. And then it tells us he died. What Genesis does not give us, what it was never designed to give us, is the texture of any of it, the interior of those years, the specific and unrepeatable experience of waking up on the second morning outside Eden, when the shock of the first morning had worn off, but nothing had yet formed to replace it. What did they say to each other when there was no one else to speak to? What did they attempt? What failed? What they believed was still possible? And what they slowly stopped believing across the long decades of learning a world that had not been built for them? What grief looks like when the person grieving has no word for grief yet. Because grief was new in the world. Because loss was new in the world. Because they had just invented both of those things by being the first people to lose something real. That is the space this family of texts was written to fill. The earliest recoverable layers of this tradition date to somewhere in the 1st through 3rd centuries of the Common Era, though the interpretive traditions being drawn on are almost certainly older. Rooted in ancient Jewish ways of reading and expanding the Genesis narrative that had been circulating for generations before anyone wrote them down in the form we now have. The text stands outside the biblical canon not chiefly because it was judged heretical or because it contained doctrine the emerging church found dangerous. It stands outside for reasons closer to questions of authority, transmission, and the particular boundaries that communities drew around Scripture over time and for their own reasons. But readers kept needing it anyway. What this family of texts offers that Genesis does not is something that might be called the emotional weather after Eden, not the theology of what happened in the garden, which Genesis addresses, not the formal consequences of what happened, which Genesis names, but the lived experience of waking up in a world that no longer fits you, without instructions, without precedent, without anyone who has done this before and can tell you what to expect. Tonight we follow that experience. Some of what you hear will have roots in the Genesis account you may already know. Much of it will not. When we move into territory that belongs to this family of traditions rather than to the biblical text, that will be clear. This is not a retelling of Genesis. This is what an older, stranger, more patient family of stories imagined Genesis left unsaid. Let your body find where it wants to rest. The chair, or the bed, or the floor. Whatever is holding your weight right now. Let it hold a little more of your weight than it was holding a moment ago. You have been keeping yourself upright all day. You have been managing and carrying and attending to things since before you were fully ready to face this morning. You do not need to do any of that anymore tonight. The first thing this account wants us to understand about Adam and Eve after Eden is not what they did in the hours immediately following. It is what they left behind. And what they left behind was not only a place, though it was a place. It was a whole category of experience that most human beings who have ever lived have never had clearly enough to even know its name. The experience of being exactly where you were made to be, of existing in a world that was organized around your presence in it, of being known, completely and continuously, by the very ground beneath your feet. They had that. And then the gate closed, and the world on the other side was waiting. Enormous. Not cruel, but not kind either. Simply present in the way that things are present when they have no particular relationship to what has just arrived among them. It did not know their names. It was not going to explain itself to them. It was the world that it was. And they were going to have to learn to live in it starting from the very beginning. That is where this story begins. Not in the garden, on the other side of it, in the long and difficult and largely unrecorded life that came after the gate closed and stayed closed. The ground was the same ground. That is the thing this account keeps returning to. Not because the detail explains anything, but because it is the place where understanding keeps breaking down. The soil beneath their feet as they walked away from Eden was the same soil they had walked on inside the garden. The stones were the same stones. The sky above them was the same sky. The air carried the same temperature, the same weight, the same composition of everything that air is made of when it is simply air and nothing more than that. And yet, there is a kind of loss that does not change the physical facts of a place. It changes the meaning of them. A hospital room after the doctor has spoken is the same room it was 20 minutes before he walked in. Same fluorescent lights above. Same chairs along the wall. Same window with the same grey afternoon light coming through it at the same angle. But the person sitting in that room is living in a completely different world than the one they were living in 20 minutes ago. No amount of the room being the same can close that distance. What changed was not the room. What changed was the frame through which the room is seen. And once that frame is gone, there is no way to see without it. Because you did not know it was there until the moment it was not. Adam and Eve walked into a world physically continuous with the one they had left. The trees were still trees. Water was still water. Light still traveled the way it travels and illuminated the things it illuminated. What was gone was the quality underneath all of it. The thing that had made all of it feel the way it felt. The presence that had been so constant and so complete that they had never needed a name for it. You do not name the air when the air has always been good. This account describes the moment of the crossing with a specificity that Genesis does not offer. The angels who had escorted them to the edge of the garden stopped at the boundary. There was a boundary, a place where the garden ended and the other world began. And the angels knew exactly where it was, even if Adam and Eve did not fully understand what they were crossing as they crossed it. The angels stopped. Adam and Eve kept walking. And at some point, without a clear marker, without a visible sign, without any announcement that what they were crossing mattered as much as it did, they moved from one kind of world into another. The gate closed behind them, and the sound of it was the first sound in human history that meant this is permanent. This direction is the only direction available to you now. The one behind you is no longer one you can walk back into. What this account wants us to feel in this moment is not the drama of it. This family of texts is not interested in drama here. It is interested in something quieter and harder to name. The physics of exile. Drama announces itself. Drama comes with the appropriate sounds and the visible signs that something important is happening. The physics of exile does not. The physics of exile is the moment you realize you have been walking for some time and nothing looks familiar. And you cannot identify exactly when familiar became unfamiliar, because the transition was too gradual to mark. It is the gap between the moment the frame breaks and the moment you understand that it has broken. That gap can be very long. There is a field of study that examines how human beings form attachments to places, how we bond. At a level largely unconscious and therefore largely invisible until something disrupts it. To the spaces that have held our most formative experiences. The spaces that have been the container for who we are. When that bond is severed, when the place is lost, what breaks is not only the relationship to the location. What breaks is the part of the self organized around that location. The part that used the place as an anchor for knowing who it was and what its life meant. This is not a claim that the ancient account knew about modern research into place attachment. It is a claim that the account was paying close attention to something real about human experience that researchers have since found their own language to describe. The text was watching the same thing, setting it at the very beginning of human history because it understood, correctly, that this kind of loss is not a minor chapter in the human story. It is the opening chapter. The angels stopped at the boundary, and Adam and Eve kept walking, and the gate closed, and the silence on the other side was a different kind of silence than any silence they had ever heard. Not the silence of Eden, which had been full of presence. The silence of a world that did not know they were in it. The silence of everything continuing exactly as it had been continuing before they arrived. With no adjustment. With no recognition, the first thing they would have noticed. Before the hunger, and before the cold, and before any of the practical difficulties that life outside was going to require them to solve, was this: that the world around them was indifferent to them, in a way that nothing in their entire previous existence had been indifferent to them, that the trees did not bend toward them the way things in Eden had seemed, in some quality difficult to name, to lean, that the light fell on them the way it fell on everything else. Without distinction, they had been known, completely and continuously, for the whole of their lives up to this moment. And now they were not. Adam stood in the first minutes of exile and felt the ground beneath his feet. The same ground, and understood something he did not yet have language for. That the loss was not only behind him in the garden he had come from. The loss was also in front of him. In every step he was going to take into a world that was not going to recognize what had just arrived in it. The loss was going to be present in every morning, in every interaction with a world that had not been made with him at its center. Eve stood beside him. The account does not give us their first words to each other in this moment, perhaps because there were no words yet for what the moment required. Perhaps because some moments are prior to language, prior to the capacity to turn what is happening into something that can be handed to another person in the form of speech. Some moments require simply standing in them, letting the weight of them accumulate before any attempt is made to name them. They stood in the world outside the garden. The gate was behind them. The same ground, the same sky, everything the same, everything different. And the long life waiting for them on this side of the gate had not yet begun to show them what it was going to ask of them. It was simply there, enormous, ready to be lived in, whether or not they were ready to live in it. They were not ready, but they were here, and here, it turned out, was the only place there was going to be. Now, And for every single day that followed, there is a voice in this text that does not appear in Genesis. Not absent the way a minor character is absent. Unnamed, but implied. Somewhere in the background of events that chose not to follow them closely. Absent in a more specific and more significant way. Present in Genesis. Certainly. Eve speaks in Genesis. She answers the serpent with words that reveal a mind already engaging with what is being offered, already evaluating and comparing and drawing conclusions. She speaks to Adam. She names her children. She is not a silent figure in the biblical account, but her account. There is a difference between a person appearing in a story and a person telling their own story. Genesis gives us Eve inside a narrative that someone else is shaping. Someone else is deciding what the camera points at, what to linger on, what to pass over, what weight to give to each moment. Eve acts and speaks within that narrative, but she does not control what the narrative chooses to hold. A portion of this ancient family of texts, particularly in certain Greek manuscript versions, gives us something different. What reads as Eve's own testimony, her telling, in her voice, addressed to her children, shaped by her understanding of what happened and why. It is worth pausing on how unusual this is before moving into what the testimony actually says. The ancient world did not commonly preserve first-person accounts by women about events that had been recorded elsewhere by other hands. The literary conventions of the period, across most of the traditions that have left surviving texts, did not routinely create this kind of space. The fact that this family of texts not only includes such a testimony but places it at the structural center of the account, gives it significant length and significant weight, is itself something worth sitting with before moving into what the testimony contains. Picture the room she was in when she gave this account. Not the garden. A room in the world, outside it. A room with walls built by human hands, functional and plainly made. Without the ease of things that had simply been given, her children gathered around her. The faces she had watched grow from the very beginning. The people who existed because she and Adam had kept going in the world that replaced the world they had been made for. She sat with them in that room, and she began to speak. This is not in Genesis. What follows comes from the tradition this family of texts preserves. Eve gathers her children deliberately. The account is specific about this. She does not wait for someone to ask. She does not offer this as a defense that has been demanded of her. She initiates. She calls them together and she says, "Let me tell you what happened. In my own words, in the order I experienced it, with the details I know because I was there." What she describes about the approach of the serpent carries details that Genesis moves past very quickly. Details that belong to this tradition and not to the biblical account. In this version, the encounter is slower and more deliberate. There is a process to it. The serpent does not simply appear and immediately begin speaking. It watches first. It observes. It waits for the right moment with a patience that the account treats as significant, because the patience itself was part of what it was doing. The right moment, when it came, was the moment when Eve was alone, when Adam was not nearby, when the conversation could happen without interruption, without the presence of another person who might have asked different questions or slowed the process down. The account understands this detail as worth recording, not because it shifts the responsibility for the choice, but because it tells us something about how the choice was made possible, that it required a specific arrangement of circumstances, that it required observation and patience and the identification of a particular window, and that the window was not permanent. It would not have held for long. Eve describes what was said and how it was said. She describes what she understood at the time and what she did not understand. And here is the thing that makes her account in this tradition different from what a reader of Genesis might expect to find when they come looking for her voice. She does not present herself as simply deceived. She presents herself as reasoning, as taking what was offered and thinking about it carefully, evaluating it against what she already knew, considering it from the angles available to her, and arriving at a conclusion she believed. At the time, with the information she had at the time, was sound. The conclusion was wrong. She knows that with a clarity that only the long years of living with the consequences of it can produce. But the wrongness of it was not immediately obvious in the way wrongness is obvious in stories told after the fact, where the mistake glows with the light of everything that followed it. In the moment, she was doing what minds do when they navigate something unfamiliar and high stakes. She was working with what she had. I chose. I believed. I was wrong. 3 separate things, all 3 true, none of them dependent on the others for their truth. This is what makes her account in this tradition more difficult and more honest than the version most people carry of this story. She does not claim innocence. She does not claim confusion that removed her from the decision. She claims something harder to hold, that she made a decision with the information she had, that the decision was wrong, and that she has been living with that fact for longer than any human being who comes after her will ever live with anything. The courage in that kind of telling is real. The refusal to soften what happened by placing the weight entirely somewhere else. The willingness to say, I chose, without using the choosing as a weapon against herself, without performing the theatrical self-punishment that guilt sometimes demands, and that looks like honesty, but is actually a different kind of evasion. Simply stating it the way a witness states what they saw. Because that is what she is doing, bearing witness to herself, to her own experience, with a precision this account treats not as self-punishment but as integrity. She also describes something the tradition preserves quite deliberately, a particular quality of bewilderment that runs underneath the testimony like a thread you feel without quite being able to trace. Not the bewilderment of someone who was simply fooled, which is a passive and relatively uncomplicated thing. The bewilderment of someone who used the mind she had been given as well as she knew how to use it, who thought carefully, who evaluated honestly, and who still arrived somewhere she never intended to go. The bewilderment of discovering that thinking carefully is not the same as thinking correctly. That good process does not guarantee good outcome. That you can do your best work and still be wrong in ways that matter enormously. That bewilderment does not excuse the choice. This family of texts is not in the business of offering excuses. What it is offering is something more useful than excuses. Accuracy. An honest account of how decisions with enormous consequences are actually made by people who are not careless and not failing to think. The tradition trusts its readers and listeners to hold that complexity without resolving it into something simpler and easier to carry. Eve finishes what she has to say. The text moves forward, but her voice, once heard here, stays with you in a way that changes how you hear the rest of the story. Because everything that follows, every decision made in the long years outside the garden, every attempt and failure and partial recovery, happens in the presence of this testimony. The testimony she will eventually ask to be written down, so that the children and the children's children will know not only what happened, but what it was like to be the one it happened to. Adam found a stone. This is the kind of detail the ancient account reaches toward without naming directly. What the manuscripts preserve is the texture of those first days outside Eden, the quality of what Adam was doing and how he was moving through the world before he had any framework for what was happening to him. And from that texture, this is what the tradition imagines a man in those first days, before survival had become a skill or loss had become a word he owned. Doing the only thing available to him, moving. He walked through the world outside the garden, the way a person walks when sitting still has become impossible, when the interior is too full of something for which no action exists yet, not toward any destination, not in any direction that meant anything yet. He walked until he found a stone, a particular stone, large enough to hold with both hands, and he picked it up. The stone had weight, temperature, specific edges that pressed into his palms in specific places. It was, in a way that almost nothing else in those early days was, simply and completely itself. It did not require anything of him. It did not reflect back the size of what had happened. It was just a stone in his hands, and holding it was something his hands could do, while the rest of him was trying to understand what his mind could not yet hold. Adam, in those first days, was not the figure of rage and accusation that a reader might carry from the moment in the garden. The pointing and the "she gave it to me." That moment is in Genesis, and it is real, and it is human, in the specific unflattering way that the worst moments of human behavior are human. But this account follows him into the long days after that moment and shows something different. A man who, when the accusation was done and the gate was closed and the world outside had received them both, went quiet in a way that had nothing theatrical in it. Not the quiet of acceptance, the quiet of someone who does not yet know how to begin to hold what has happened. He learned things in those first days through his hands, before he learned them through any other means. He learned the weight of different stones, the resistance of different soils underfoot, the specific texture of bark on different kinds of trees. He learned that the ground outside the garden pushed back against him differently than the ground inside it had, that some surfaces gave way and some held firm, that the physical world had a grammar to it, rules about what could bear weight and what would not, what yielded and what resisted. Rules he had never needed to learn inside the garden, because inside the garden the physical world had arranged itself around him. Outside, the arrangement was his problem. He moved through the landscape with his hands open, feeling for things he did not yet have words for, not because he could not see, but because seeing was not the same as knowing, and knowing was what he needed. And the only way available in those first days to reach toward knowing was contact. In the garden, Adam had been the creature who named the world. He had looked at each living thing with enough attention to find the word that fit it. And the finding had been his primary experience of what it meant to be alive in that place. Not administrative, relational. His way of being in genuine contact with the world around him. His way of making the world legible to himself and making himself part of the world's legibility. Outside the garden, he kept trying to name things, but the naming felt different now. In the garden, the names had been received by the world they described. The world leaned into them. Outside, the names landed, and the world continued. The stone he was holding did not become more itself when he found the word for it. The word was just a word. The stone was just a stone. And the gap between those two things, which had not existed inside the garden, was now present in every act of naming he attempted. He noticed this. He noticed it because he was the kind of person who noticed precisely, who had spent his whole life in the garden paying exact attention to the exact nature of things. That habit of attention did not leave him when the gate closed. What changed was what the attention found. What it found now was absence where presence had been, gap where connection had been, the specific and measurable distance between what a thing was now and what it had been inside the garden. He picked things up, set them down, moved through the landscape with his hands as much as with his feet. He spoke to the sun at some point in those first days, not the extended address to the elements of the cosmos that would come later. The sustained practice across the middle years of his life outside the garden. This was earlier than that and less deliberate. He was standing in an open place, and the sun was there, and something came out of him in the direction of it. Not a prayer with a specific request. Something more like the sound that comes out of a person when something too large to hold internally finds the only available exit, which is the mouth, and the nearest available recipient, which is whatever happens to be present. The sun moved across the sky the way it had always moved. Without adjusting, he put the stone down eventually. The account does not tell us what he said to Eve in those first days and nights, or whether he said much of anything at all. What it records is the quality of those days as experienced from inside them. The particular texture of a grief that has no precedent and therefore no available framework for understanding itself. The grief of the first people, who had to invent not only the skills of survival in a world they had not been made for, but the emotional vocabulary for what survival outside the place you were made for actually feels like when you are living it for the first time. Adam moved through those days with his hands open and his attention close to the ground, learning the grammar of the outside world, learning which direction water ran, what the sky looked like before rain, what sounds at night required attention, and what sounds could be released, learning what held and what gave way, not because it was what he wanted, because it was what was required, and the requiring of it, he was slowly discovering, had no opinion about whether he was ready. The world outside the gate did not ask permission before it required things of him. It simply required, and the requiring continued. Every stone he picked up was just a stone. Every name he found for things landed without the particular warmth that names had carried inside the garden. And he kept going, because stopping was not something the outside world offered as an option, and because somewhere beside him, in the same enormous landscape, Eve was also keeping going. Her presence was not comfort in any simple sense. It was something more fundamental than comfort. It was the fact of not being the only one here, of navigating this impossible thing in the company of someone who was also navigating this impossible thing, step by step, in the same indifferent world. That fact alone, not the resolution of anything, not the answer to any of the questions the outside world was placing in front of them, just the fact of her there, still moving, still in contact with the same ground he was in contact with, still finding, as he was finding, that the next step was possible, even when the next step was all that was available. It was enough to continue, not enough to make any of it easy, not enough to close the gap between the word and the stone, or between the world outside and the world they had come from, but enough to take the next step, and the one after that, and the one after that, which was, in those first days, the whole of what was needed, the whole of what was possible. They did not know they were hungry at first. This is one of the details this family of texts preserves, that Genesis, moving at its characteristic pace, does not pause to record. But this account pauses here deliberately, because there is something important about the specific shape of those first days outside Eden that disappears when the story moves past them too quickly. The days before survival had become a skill they possessed. The days when they were still operating on an assumption so foundational to every moment of their existence that it had never once surfaced into conscious thought. The assumption that the world would provide. In Eden, provision had been constant and structural. Not because Adam and Eve had not worked, because they had tended the garden, and the tending was real work, with real attention behind it. But the food had been there regardless. The abundance had been built into the design of the place itself. The trees bore fruit, because that was what trees in that place did. Reliably, generously, without requiring anything of Adam and Eve beyond the simple willingness to reach for what was already being offered. They had never felt the body begin to signal that something it required was not arriving. They walked out of Eden and they kept walking. The world they walked into was full of plants and roots and fruit and things that grew from the earth in forms that looked, from a distance, not entirely unlike what they had known inside the garden. But distance was the problem. What looked familiar from a distance was not familiar up close. These were trees that existed according to a different logic than the trees inside the garden. Trees that had not been placed here for Adam and Eve. Trees that were part of a world running according to its own seasons and its own purposes. none of which had been organized around the arrival of two people who were accustomed to being the center of the arrangement. The food existed. Technically, the nourishment was present in this world, the way that answers to problems are sometimes present in a room full of people who do not yet know what they are looking for. It was there, but it did not present itself. It did not offer itself. It did not make itself available in the way the abundance of Eden had made itself available, which was the way of something given rather than something that had to be found and identified and reached for and prepared. They walked for 7 days. 7 days is specific in the way that numbers in this account tend to be specific, not 3, which would suggest the problem resolved quickly, not 40, which would suggest an ordeal of a different magnitude. 7, a full cycle, long enough for the body to move through the early stages of genuine deprivation, long enough for what started as strangeness to become discomfort, for discomfort to become something harder to think around, for that something to become the primary thing the body was communicating to the mind. On some of those days they found things they could eat. On others, they found very little. And the texture of a day when you find very little, when the hours pass, with the body keeping its running account of what is owed and what has not arrived, is not something that anyone who has always had enough can easily imagine from the outset. Real hunger, the kind that has been present for more than a day, does not feel like wanting food. It feels like the removal of something structural, like a load-bearing element taken out of a building that is still standing but standing differently now, with a precariousness in it that was not there before, a sense that the arrangement that had held is no longer holding with the same confidence it held before. Adam felt this before he had a name for it. Eve felt this before either of them had found language for what was happening in their bodies. The physical reality of it arrived first. The specific location of the sensation, the way it moved through the hours of the day. Lighter in the early morning when the previous day's small findings were still present in the body. Heavier by afternoon. Heaviest in the evening when the light was failing and the prospect of finding anything before dark was shrinking toward nothing. The way it changed the quality of attention, pulling it toward the immediate and the practical and away from everything that was not directly related to the problem of food. The way it made the world smaller, collapsed the horizon of concern down to the next few hours. The next possible source. The next attempt. This was new. All of this was entirely new. There had been nothing in the garden to prepare them for any of it. The account records that at some point in those 7 days, they stopped walking. They sat down, not because they had arrived somewhere, because the walking had not produced what was needed, and sitting down was the only alternative that presented itself. They sat in the dust and the dry grass of the world outside Eden, in the middle of a landscape that had food somewhere in it, and none of the food was being found right now. And the sensation in their bodies was real and present, and had been insisting on being acknowledged for longer than they had been acknowledging it. They wept. The account records this without commentary and without judgment. They wept, not from despair in the complete and final sense, though something that could become despair was certainly present in those moments. Not from self-pity alone, though the self-pity that was also present was understandable, and the account does not condemn it. They wept because weeping was what was true.
Because it was the most accurate response their bodies could produce to the distance between what their lives had been 7 days ago and what their lives were, at this exact moment, in this exact dust, with this exact sensation, in their patter, bodies, and no clear path forward. There is a kind of weeping that is not surrender, not the collapse of the will or the abandonment of the capacity to continue. Simply the body's accurate report on what is currently happening to it. The acknowledgement, before the next effort begins, that this is real and this is hard, and the difficulty of it deserves to be registered before being set aside in favor of what has to come next. Adam and Eve sat in the dust, and the weeping was accurate. What the account does not give us in those 7 days is a catalogue of their discoveries. It does not list the specific plants they eventually learned to eat or describe the process by which they figured out what was edible and what was not, what required preparation and what could be consumed directly. What it gives us is the sitting down and the weeping, and then, simply and without ceremony, the standing up. Because what matters is not the specific knowledge accumulated in those 7 days, which was real and necessary, and was the beginning of a competence that would grow across the years into something genuine. What matters is the structure of the experience, the arrival of genuine unfulfilled need in people who had never felt it, the discovery that the body has requirements that are not optional, and that the world will not automatically meet those requirements, and that the gap between what the body needs and what the world automatically provides has to be closed by effort, by learning, by the slow and not always successful work of figuring out what this world has and how to reach it.
They stood up. The account says this, and moves forward without lingering on the moment. They stood up, not because the problem was solved, not because the hunger was relieved, or the situation was better than it had been when they sat down. The world was exactly the same as it had been. The body's requirements had not changed. The difficulty had not become less difficult. They stood up because standing up was what came next. And what came next was always in the world outside the gate, the only direction available. They had been sitting in the dust of a world that did not provide for them automatically. They stood up into the same world, and they began, for the first time, the long work of learning to live in it, not gracefully, not with any certainty that the learning would succeed, but deliberately, with the specific and unremarkable courage of people who stand up not because they are ready, but because sitting down is no longer the right thing either. They stood up. They began. Adam had a theory. It did not arrive suddenly. It came to him the way that certain understandings come when the mind has been working on a problem longer than the mind itself knows it has been working, surfacing from somewhere beneath the daily effort of the first weeks and months outside the gate. An idea that kept presenting itself from different angles, asserting itself in the middle of other thoughts, until he gave it enough attention to examine it directly and find out what it actually was. The theory began with what he knew about how the garden had worked. In Eden, everything had occupied its proper position within a design that was not arbitrary. Every creature, every element, every relationship between things had a function, a role, a place within the whole that was specific to it and could not simply be exchanged with any other place. And existing within your proper position in that design was not a constraint. It was a completion, the way a hand fits a tool made specifically for it. Not constrained by the fit, completed by it. What had happened in the garden, as Adam understood it, was a displacement, a stepping out of position, a movement from the place they had been made for into a relationship with the created order that their design had not accounted for. And the consequences they were living with were not only the result of punishment, though they were that too. They were the natural result of being out of position in a system that required position to function. The way a joint dislocated from its socket is not being punished by the pain that follows. It is simply a joint, no longer where joints are supposed to be. And the pain is the accurate signal of that displacement. If displacement was the nature of the problem, Adam reasoned, then perhaps the direction of any possible solution lay in returning to right relationship with the created order. Not a return to Eden, which was closed and which he understood was not going to open again for him, but a return to the posture of Eden, the posture of a creature fully within the order of things, fully submitted to the world as it was made, rather than set against the grain of it. He proposed standing in the river, not briefly and not as a symbolic gesture, for 40 days, in the Jordan, without moving, without speaking, without eating, becoming, as much as a person could become, something fully within the created order rather than a subject imposing demands on it, giving the world his complete stillness and his complete attention and his complete willingness to be in it rather than require things from it. He asked Eve to do the same in the Tigris for 37 days. What follows here belongs to this family of texts and not to the Genesis account. Genesis does not record a penance in the rivers. These details, the 2 rivers and the specific number of days, belong to this ancient tradition's imagination of what the years after the exile might have required of Adam and Eve. Hold that distinction clearly as the scene continues. The numbers are specific in the way details in this account tend to be specific when they are reaching for accuracy rather than elegance. 40 and 37. Not rounded, not symmetrical, not chosen because they fit a satisfying pattern. The kind of numbers that appear in accounts where someone was trying to record what actually happened, or what the tradition believed actually happened, with a precision that has not been cleaned up into something more aesthetically pleasing than the truth warrants. They went to their rivers. Stay with the physical reality of this before moving to what happened next. Cold water, the cold arriving at the skin first, at the feet, and then the ankles, and then moving gradually up the legs. Not a single shock, but a sustained demand on the body to hold its temperature against the steady pull of water at a different temperature. The current pressing against legs that are standing still in it, requiring a constant low-level muscular adjustment to maintain the standing. The riverbed underfoot, uneven, shifting slightly with the current, requiring a constant attention to balance that never fully became unconscious because the riverbed kept changing. The quality of the light on the surface of the water, the sound of the current moving around and past them while they stood within it. The specific quality of cold at the beginning of the day versus the cold at the end of the day versus the cold in the middle of the night when the temperature dropped and the darkness made the sensation sharper and more present rather than less. 40 days is a long time to stand in a river. 37 days is not much shorter. The body has a very clear and very consistent opinion about both of those numbers. And the opinion does not improve significantly as the days accumulate. What Adam was doing in the Jordan was submitting to the experience of being indistinguishable from the other things in the river's path. The water moved around him the way it moved around the stones on the riverbed, without recognition, without any awareness of who he was or what he had done or how far he had traveled to stand in this particular water with this particular intention. The river did not know him. And in not knowing him, the river treated him the way it treated everything else in its path. As simply another thing, the water moved around. There is a quality of rest in that. Strange as it sounds, for someone who has recently been the center of a world that knew his name completely, the river did not know his name, and the not knowing was, in its own strange and specific way, a form of rest. Eve stood in the Tigris, and the account does not linger on her interior experience during those 37 days in the way it will give us her voice elsewhere. It records her presence, both rivers, both people, the same theory guiding both of them, the same uncertainty underneath the theory about whether theories were even the right instrument for this kind of problem. Because Adam's theory had a genuine insight at its center, the insight that the posture of a person matters. That how you hold yourself in relation to the created order has something to do with what that order is able to give you. That stillness and submission are not the same as passivity. That allowing rather than demanding is its own kind of action. The garden itself had demonstrated something like this in the way abundance had flowed from being in right relationship rather than from extracting. The theory was not wrong in the way that bad theories are wrong. It was incomplete in the way that first theories are almost always incomplete. First theories are built from the information available at the time, and the information available to Adam about the nature of what had happened to them was by any honest accounting. Very limited. He was doing what any mind does when it is working at the edge of what it can see, constructing the best available hypothesis from the available evidence, designing an experiment to test the hypothesis, and standing in the river. This is not nothing. The same impulse produces every serious attempt at understanding. The willingness to build a theory from what you know. Commit to testing it, and find out what the test reveals. What the test revealed is where the account goes next. The Jordan received Adam without comment. The Tigris received Eve without comment. The days passed, the way days pass inside a commitment that has decided its duration in advance, regardless of what the duration feels like from inside it. Each morning the water was there. Each afternoon the water was there. Each night the cold was different. Sharper. The darkness, making the sensation more present rather than less. The current continued. The riverbed continued. What the account skips, with the economy of ancient texts, is the interior of those days. The specific content of what passed through Adam on day 22 or Eve on day 31. What held them in the water when holding became difficult. What they thought about in the hours when the physical sensation had become so familiar it no longer required the same level of attention. All of that is not given to us. What the account gives us instead is the event that broke through it. The interruption did not come from God. It came from the place where the plan was most vulnerable. Not where Adam was standing. Where Eve was standing. Alone. On the banks of the Tigris. In her 37th day. One day before the end. Eve was in her 37th day in the river when he appeared on the bank. 37 days of standing in cold water without moving. Without speaking. Without eating. 37 days of the body making its various objections and the will overriding them. Day after day. Because the commitment had been made, and the commitment was the point, and the only way the commitment meant anything was to honor it. Especially when honoring it was difficult. Most especially on the days when it was most difficult. She was 37 days in, one day from the completion. He appeared on the bank one day before the end. The account is specific about the form he took. And the specificity matters. Not the serpent. The serpent was known now in a way it had not been in the garden. That form carried the full weight of what it had meant the first time. It would have been recognized. He came in a different form, as something that looked, to a person standing in cold water at the very end of 37 days of the most serious spiritual effort of her life outside the garden. Like an angle, radiant, standing at the edge of the water with a particular quality of stillness. The stillness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just, in the moments before you are seeing them, been relieved of it. The posture that belongs to the body when a burden it has been holding is finally set down. And he was weeping. This is the detail the account places at the center of what followed. Not mentioned once and moved past. Returned to. He was visibly, apparently, genuinely moved. The way a person is moved when they have received something they did not expect to receive, and the receiving of it has not yet settled, and the rawness of it is still present in the face and the voice and the quality of the stillness, before moving into what he said. Stay with the weeping itself for a moment, because understanding what it was doing is understanding why it worked. Human beings respond to the apparent suffering of others. This is not a flaw in how we are made. It is one of the most important features of what we are. The capacity to perceive pain in another and feel that pain as relevant to yourself. To feel it as something that makes a claim on your attention and your response is the root of care. It is the foundation of every form of generosity and compassion that makes human community possible. It is a genuinely good thing, and it can be used against you. The part of us that responds to suffering cannot easily distinguish. In the immediate moment of the encounter, between suffering that is real and suffering that is performed with sufficient skill. The signal comes through the same channels. The tears look the same. The posture of relief looks the same. The voice carrying the texture of genuine emotion sounds the same as a voice actually carrying genuine emotion. And by the time the analytical part of the mind has begun to formulate questions that might reveal the performance for what it is, the responsive part has already moved toward the apparent suffering, has already begun to reach. Now hold that alongside Eve's situation. This account imagines her 37 days into the most serious, sustained effort of her life outside the garden. She was there because she understood that what she had participated in required a response proportionate to its weight. She was not in the river lightly. She was there with the full seriousness of someone who had lived every day since the gate closed in the presence of that weight and had found, through this sustained effort, the way of addressing it that included the genuine and serious hope that the addressing was leading somewhere real, that the weight was finite, that there was a point at which it would be lifted. And he was standing on the bank, weeping with the specific quality of someone who had just had that kind of burden lifted. And he was offering her the same. He told her that God had heard her, that the 37 days were complete in the eyes of what they had been undertaken to address, that he himself had come before God and been received with mercy, that if mercy extended to him, then certainly it extended to her, that she could come out of the water now, that the 37 days had been enough. He was weeping when he said it. Eve came out of the water, not carelessly, not because she had been looking for a reason to stop. She came out because what she heard and what she saw aligned precisely with the shape of what she most deeply needed to be true. The offer was not approximately right. It was not close to the hope she had been carrying. It was the exact shape of the hope, as though someone had studied the hope carefully and then constructed the offer around it with precision. Not approximately, exactly. She walked back toward Adam. As she walked, the account records something arriving in her, not all at once, the way certain recognitions arrive, moving through stages, each stage revealing more of what the previous stage had been approaching. A quality of knowing coming slowly, and then with increasing clarity, and then with the particular finality of understanding something you cannot understand partially. She had moved again before she was certain it was safe to move. The same mechanism, a different river, a different form, a different day, but the same mechanism, which had not required carelessness or stupidity or a failure of attention, which had required only that the person on the receiving end had a genuine need and that the offer was shaped precisely around that need. Adam saw her coming across the distance between them. He saw her face before she was close enough to speak. He understood before she said anything. His response in this moment is worth noting carefully because this account is careful about it. His response was not anger. Anger would have been understandable. Anger would have been human in the way that the less generous human responses are human. But the account records grief, a very particular grief. The grief of someone who had constructed a plan specifically designed to prevent the thing that has just happened from happening, who had stood in cold water for days past the point of comfort because the plan was the point and the plan was supposed to be sufficient, and who is now looking at the face of the person coming toward him and understanding that no plan he can construct will be sufficient against this. He wept, not at her, with her, both of them now outside their rivers, both of them on the wrong side of another serious attempt, both of them in the specific position of people who had brought everything available to them to the best thing they knew to do and had found that the best thing they knew was not enough. The account does not rush past this moment. It stays here, because this quiet and undramatic moment, this specific moment of two people who have tried and found their trying inadequate, is not unusual in the human experience. It does not announce itself. It simply arrives. And what it requires is not resolution, not explanation, not the next step yet visible. Only the staying. The water of the Tigris continued behind them, moving the way water moves, without memory and without opinion, carrying nothing forward but itself. They were still outside the garden. They were still together. The account keeps watching them with the patience of something that has decided to watch all the way to the end. Years settled into years. The account does not count them here. Does not tell us which year of the 930 this night falls in. It gives us something more useful than a year. It gives us the quality of the night itself, the sense that it arrives somewhere in the long middle of their life, outside the garden. Not because anything particular happened that day to distinguish it from the days before, but because something in the long accumulation of days had reached a point where it needed to be set down somewhere outside the body that had been carrying it. Adam went outside. He stood under the sky. The sky at night was the same sky that had been above them, inside the garden. The same stars in the same arrangements, in the darkness above. The same light traveling from sources so far away that what reaches a human eye had left its origin before any person alive below was born, and will continue traveling long after every person currently alive is gone. The distances involved are larger than the human mind can genuinely hold, which is perhaps another way of saying that the night sky has always exceeded the capacity of the people looking up at it to fully contain what they are seeing. That was true in Adam's night as it is true in this one. He stood under the sky, and he began to speak, not prayer in the form that prayer would later develop into. The structured address to a known recipient through established channels with language developed specifically for the purpose. Something older than that, less certain, less organized. He called out toward the stars, toward the darkness between them, in the general direction of whatever was behind the sky rather than in front of it. Not because he believed the stars possessed the kind of consciousness that could receive and process what he was saying in any technical sense, because they were there, because they were the oldest things visible to him from where he stood, and in a world where the direct line to what he was trying to reach had been altered by something he still did not fully understand. The most ancient things visible were the closest approximation to the source he was trying to address. He asked the stars to carry his words. Something like this appears again and again in the Psalms, not because the accounts are the same or because they share a direct literary relationship, but because the impulse is recognizable across the distance between them. The psalmists address mountains and rivers and morning stars and the deep places of the ocean. They call on the created world to witness and to carry and to convey. They speak to things that cannot speak back in the conventional sense because the need to say something is more urgent than the certainty that someone fully adequate is on the other end to receive it. Adam spoke to the stars for the same reason. Not confusion about their nature, the need to say what was inside him, and the stars were the most available direction for the going. He spoke for a long time. The account does not preserve the specific words of this night. That choice is worth noticing. Some ancient texts record long speeches word for word because the words themselves are the point. Because what was said is what needs to be transmitted. This account records that Adam spoke, records the posture of the speaking, the looking upward, the addressing of the oldest things visible, and then moves forward without giving us the content. This suggests the account understood this night not as a specific speech with specific recoverable words, but as a practice. Something Adam returned to across the long middle years of his life outside the garden. Not what was said on any particular night, but the sustained act of saying, the commitment, maintained across years, to continuing to address what he was trying to address, even when the channel felt indirect, even when the stars moved in response to physics rather than to him. This is what people who maintain any consistent practice over a long period of time eventually discover, that the individual instance is not always the point, that what the practice builds, over time, is not a collection of significant individual moments, but an orientation, a direction the body learns, a way of turning that becomes available even when everything else feels unavailable. Adam had spent his whole existence in Eden as the creature whose primary relationship with the world was through attention and language. He had looked at each living thing carefully enough to find its name. That act had been his way of being in genuine contact with reality. Outside Eden, the naming continued. He could not stop it, but it had nowhere obvious to go. So he sent it upward, toward the oldest things, toward the sky that connected the ground he was standing on to whatever lay behind it. The stars did not respond in any literal sense. The account does not claim they did. What it does suggest, quietly and without insisting on it, is that the speaking was not nothing, that the sustained act of addressing the available direction was doing something real, even if what it was doing was not fully visible to Adam. Even if it would not become visible for a long time, the night continued. No voice came back through the darkness in the form Adam might have hoped for. The stars continued their ancient movement. The movement that does not pause for the individual nights of individual people standing below and looking up and needing something from what they are looking at. But the account keeps this night. It passes it forward through all the languages and all the hands that carried this family of texts across 20 centuries. The people who kept copying it could have left this scene out. The narrative would have been complete without it. They chose not to leave it out, which means they recognized this night, had stood under their own skies with their own losses and their own words going upward into darkness that did not answer in the form they needed, and had found, despite that the sending was still worth doing. Adam stood under the sky, and he spoke. The night received him the way nights receive everyone who comes to them with something too large to carry alone into sleep. In the silence after, which was not the absence of sound, but a different quality of presence, the stars continued their movement. Indifferent because they did not know he was there. Faithful because they continued regardless. And out here, in the long middle of a life, built in a world that was not Eden, those two qualities had turned out to be the same thing. Then the dream came. Eve had dreamed before. In the years outside the garden, sleep had occasionally brought something that felt, for the duration of the dreaming, like the quality of what it had been to be inside Eden. The mind, in its nighttime looseness, sometimes produced a texture of experience that resembled what she had lost. She had learned not to carry those dreams too directly into the waking day. Learned not to mistake what sleep made available for what the waking world was actually offering. This dream was different. She knew it was different before she was fully awake. There is a category of dream that carries its own signal, a quality distinct from ordinary dreaming that the body registers before the mind has catalogued the content. She felt it before she opened her eyes, and then she opened them, and she held what she had seen. What follows belongs to this ancient family of texts, and not to the Genesis account. Genesis records what happened to Cain and Abel. This tradition imagines what happened in the night before, in the space between the warning and the event, and it is important to hold that distinction clearly as the account continues. In the dream, Eve saw her son Cain, and what she saw on her son Cain was blood, the blood of Abel. She saw it with the particular clarity that certain dreams achieve, a clarity that does not soften what it shows, the way waking perception tends to soften things. The image was direct, it was specific, and it was not ambiguous in the way she might have wanted it to be ambiguous. She woke. She lay still. She let the dream sit in her with its full weight before she moved. She told Adam. The account records this sequence carefully. The dream, the waking, the stillness, and then the telling. Not because the sequence is complicated, but because each step in it carries weight. She did not keep it to herself. She did not decide it was only a dream, and therefore not the kind of thing that required action. She told Adam before the morning had moved far. while the dream was still fully present in her, before the ordinary demands of the day had had any chance to dilute what she was carrying. Adam heard it. The account records his response with a precision worth sitting with. He did not dismiss what she told him. He did not offer reassurance that it was only a dream and therefore nothing to act on. He heard her, and he was troubled by what he heard. And the trouble produced in him not a clear direction but the specific discomfort of someone being asked to take seriously a possibility that, if taken seriously, requires action that is neither simple nor available in a clean form. What could they do with what they had? A dream and its accompanying dread and the limited tools available to parents who love their children and cannot see inside them clearly enough to address directly what they can only perceive through the indirect form that dreaming provides. They could not reach into Cain and find the thing and remove it. They could not confront directly what they could only see obliquely. What they could do was create distance, put geography between the two of them, give the situation room to be something other than what the dream had shown. Cain went east. Abel stayed. And then Abel died. The account does not slow at the killing itself. It moves past it with the velocity Genesis also uses. What it gives us instead is the aftermath, the particular quality of grief that arrived for Adam and Eve with this specific loss, because this grief was unlike any grief they had carried before. They had been carrying grief since the day the gate closed. The grief of Eden and what it had been, and what its absence meant. They had been living inside that grief for the entirety of their life outside the garden. They had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to inhabit it. It had become part of the structure of them rather than something separate they were carrying, part of what they were made of now. This grief was built differently. This grief had come from their child's hands. And the grief of something that happened to your child sits in a place that the grief of something that happened to you does not reach. It has a different specific gravity. It presses differently. And this grief carried something inside it that the other griefs had not carried. The dream that Eve had seen and told, the action they had taken in response to it, the action that had been real and considered and represented the best available response to what they had been given to work with. The action that had not been enough, that the thing had happened anyway, and the not enoughness of the action was now inside the grief, woven into it, asking questions that a grief without warning would not have asked. What else could have been done? What path had been available and not taken? What the outcome might have been if the response had been different or earlier or more complete. The circuit that runs after a loss that arrived with warning runs differently from the circuit that runs after a loss that arrived without warning. It passes through the decisions that were made and the alternatives that existed and the places where the path might have branched in a different direction. It does not reach a conclusion. It runs. Adam and Eve ran that circuit. The account does not record them broken by it in the final sense. What it records is the staying present inside a grief that was more complicated than grief usually is because it contained within it not only the loss, but the question of the loss. Not only what happened, but the shadow of whether anything different might have. They had been learning since the day they left Eden what it meant to bring everything available to the best thing they knew to do and still have the worst available outcome happen. The hunger in those first 7 days had been a version of that lesson. The rivers and what the river could not prevent had been a version. Each version had been real and had cost something real. But not one of those had cost a child. Not one of those had required them to hold the weight of a loss traceable, in the most direct way imaginable, through their own existence into the world, the weight of someone who had been alive because they were alive and who was now not. That weight sits differently. The account knows this, and it stays with the difference rather than smoothing past it. Outside, the same stars Adam had addressed on the nights he stood under the sky, with his words going upward, continued their movement. They did not slow for this. They did not know about Abel. They moved the way they always moved. with the faithful indifference that had become, across the long middle years of exile, one of the few reliable constants in the world outside the garden. Below them, two people sat with the newest and heaviest thing the world outside the garden had yet required of them. And they remained, not because remaining solved anything, not because the weight they were carrying was lighter for the remaining, but because remaining was what they knew how to do, because they had been learning, across all the attempts and all the losses. That remaining was the condition that made everything else possible. That from the remaining, in time, the next thing became visible. They remained. The night continued, and when morning came, the way mornings come without asking whether the people who must face them are ready, they faced it. Adam was dying, not quickly, not in the way that stories built around urgency stage a death. With sudden collapse, and the gathering of everyone in panicked haste, and the sense of time running out in ways that can be felt in the room. Slowly, the way something very old and very large moves toward its end, with a quality of deliberateness that has nothing theatrical in it. That is simply what it is. The body, after a very long time of doing what bodies do, beginning to do it with less reliability and then approaching the point where it would stop altogether. 930 years. Hold that number before moving past it. Not as a theological claim about the lifespans recorded in the early chapters of Genesis, as an attempt to receive what this account is reaching toward when it gives Adam that specific number. 930 years of waking up in a world that was not Eden. 930 mornings of opening his eyes in a landscape that was not the landscape he had been made for. 930 years of the sun rising over terrain that he had learned to inhabit without ever fully inhabiting it in the way that the garden had been inhabited, with the quality of rightness that belongs to a creature in the place that was made for it. 930 years of the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the one after that. And now the body was reaching its end. He called for Seth. Of all the children Adam and Eve had across the long centuries of their life outside the garden, and this family of texts understood them to have had many, the one this account follows with the most sustained attention is Seth. Not because Seth was the oldest or the most powerful or the most significant in the genealogical line that Genesis preserves, but because Seth was the one present at the end, the one Adam looked at in those final weeks and understood as the person for what needed to be done. Seth came, and Adam told him what he needed. The pain was real. The account is specific about this, in a way that matters. Adam, in those final weeks, was not abstracted from his body, in the way that dying sometimes produces a certain remoteness from the physical. He was very much inside it. Inside its specific and located discomfort. Inside what it feels like when a body that has been working for 930 years begins to signal that the working is completing. And the signal takes the form of pain that is present and insistent and making its claim on his attention alongside everything else he was trying to hold and say and give in those final weeks. As far as Adam understood the situation, there was one possible address for that pain: the oil of mercy. This is what this family of texts calls what Adam sends Seth to find. Not a medicine, in any sense a modern reader would recognize. Not a compound with identifiable properties and a testable mechanism of action. Something older than that and stranger than that. Something the account describes as associated with the tree of life. The tree that had stood at the center of the garden, whose fruit had not been eaten before the gate closed, and which was now inside a boundary that no human being had crossed since the day Adam and Eve had walked out through it in the other direction. What Adam believed, or hoped, or needed to believe in those final weeks, was that if Seth could reach the gate and speak to whatever messenger waited there and ask in the right way for the right thing, the oil of mercy might be given, that it might be brought back, that it might address what the pain was asking to be addressed. Not only the relief of the physical suffering, though the physical suffering was real, something more than that. A small and final return of something, some portion of what the garden had carried, brought back across the closed boundary to the man who had been made there and had spent 930 years on the other side of it. It was not a plan built on certainty. Certainty had been a feature of Eden and had not transferred to the world outside it. This was a plan built on the willingness to act on what seemed possible rather than sit in the fact of what was not. Eve said she would go with Seth. The account records this without explanation or elaboration. And the absence of explanation is itself a kind of statement. She did not need to go. The journey was Seth's. The task had been given to him. He was grown and capable. But the idea of remaining in the place where Adam was dying and waiting for Seth to return from the direction of the garden without going herself was simply not something she was able to do. After 900 years of doing everything alongside Adam, the last attempt was not going to be one she watched from a distance. They set out together, the road toward Eden. If road is even the right word, for whatever path existed in that direction. Was not a path that most people traveled, not primarily because of prohibition, though the gate was closed and the boundary was real, but because most of the people living in the world that had accumulated since Adam and Eve's exile had built their lives in directions that were not toward Eden. They had oriented their settlements and their agriculture and their daily rhythms toward the practical requirements of the world they actually inhabited. Eden had become, for most of them, the story, the origin always somewhere else, always in the past, the thing spoken of by their parents and their parents' parents, which existed in a different register than the fields where you planted your grain and the walls within which you slept. Seth had grown up with Eden in that register. He had heard his father describe it across the whole span of his life. Patient and specific descriptions returned to again and again, reaching for language that kept not quite arriving. Because what Adam was trying to describe was an experience for which the outside world had not produced adequate language. Seth had heard his mother's account of what happened in the garden, told the way the account records her telling it. He had grown up with Eden as the most present, absent thing imaginable. The place always in the room, even when no one was speaking of it. The place that explained the shape of the life he had been born into, without ever having been there himself. Now he was walking toward it. The account records that they were attacked on the road. An animal came at them. The text does not specify what kind, and the specific species is probably not the point. An animal in the world outside Eden that had no inheritance of the arrangement that had existed inside the garden. No memory of what the relationship between human beings and the living world had been in that place. An animal attending to its own requirements without reference to the needs of two people walking through its territory. Seth confronted it. He spoke to it in the name of Adam, in the name of the man who had given language to every living thing. And the animal, the account records, stilled, not with the comprehension that follows when language lands in a mind built for language, but with the particular quality of stilling that happens when something in the register or authority of what is being encountered gives a creature pause. When it encounters something it cannot account for in its ordinary framework, the animal moved aside. What this scene does in the architecture of the whole account is establish something about Seth before he arrives at the gate. Not the garden itself, which cannot be inherited. Not the ease of the garden, which was not transmissible through blood, but something of what Adam had been given in the garden. The quality of attention and authority that had made Adam the creature who named the living world. That quality had not simply ceased when the gate closed. It had moved forward through the generations in reduced and partial form, carried into the children and the children's children, the way certain things move through families. Not identically, not completely, but recognizably. Seth carried enough of it that an animal on the road to Eden moved aside. In an account that has been watching everything diminish since the day of the exile, that is not a small thing. They walked until the quality of what surrounded them began to change. Not geographically. The change was not in the measurable properties of the terrain. The soil and the stone and the vegetation did not shift in ways that a careful observer would have recorded as geographically significant. The change was in something else. A quality of the light. A quality of the silence around them. A quality of what it felt like to move through the space they were moving through. As though the air itself had a different density of attention in it. Seth had been told about this quality his entire life, had built an understanding of it from his parents' various attempts to describe it, had grown up with a sense of it without ever having been near enough to the source to feel it directly. Now he was feeling it, and what he felt did not fit inside the category he had brought to it. He had brought the category of the lost home, the place that should have been his but wasn't. The origin closed before he existed. What he encountered as they came close enough to feel the edge of it was something that did not fit inside that category. Something larger and stranger and more itself than any understanding assembled from someone else's memories could have prepared him to hold. They stopped at the gate, and the gate was there. Seth stood at the gate and looked through. He had known it would be there, had been told about it across the whole of his life, had built his understanding of it from everything his parents had described and everything the tradition of his family had made of it in the decades and centuries since the day Adam and Eve had walked through it, going the other way. He knew about what guarded it. He knew about the boundary and what maintained the boundary. But knowing about a place and standing at that place are not the same experience. They are almost never the same experience. The description, however detailed and however offered with love and precision by the person giving it, is still a description, still assembled from language. And language, however precise, is a different medium from standing in a specific location with that location present to your senses in all the ways that presence actually works, through light and air and the specific quality of the silence around you and what the thing you came to see looks like when you are actually looking at it from the place where you are actually standing. Seth stood at the gate and found that the gate exceeded what he had been able to imagine it. He looked through. What he saw inside is preserved in this version of the tradition with a deliberate restraint. It does not give us an inventory of Eden. It does not produce a catalogue of the wonders visible through the gate, organized to give the listener a complete and detailed picture of the garden as seen from outside its boundary. What it gives us is something that is in some ways more powerful than a complete picture. Impression. The impressions of a man standing at the edge of something for which he has no fully adequate category. Receiving what the gate makes visible in the form that overwhelming experience tends to take, which is not organized detail but quality. Light that was not like the light on his side of the gate. Not necessarily brighter, not necessarily warmer, but different in its quality, in the specific way it behaved toward the things it illuminated, in the sense it gave of being light that had a source that attended to it in a way ordinary light does not attend to what it illuminates. Trees that were not like the trees he had grown up among, different, not in species or in size, but in the quality of their aliveness, in the way they carried their existence, in the sense they gave of being exactly where they were supposed to be. And then, further in, through the light that was different from ordinary light, the thing his father had described and returned to and reached for language for across all the years of Seth's life. The tree of life. This is what the tradition imagines Seth seeing through the gate. Not what the manuscripts record as literal observed fact, but what this account pictures Seth encountering as he stood at the boundary. He looked through, and the tree was there, and he recognized it, not because he had ever seen it, but because he had been hearing his father try to describe it since he was old enough to receive what his father was trying to say. He held what he was seeing with the full attention of someone who understands they will not be here long. That, what is being given, is a sight and not a stay. and that the sight must be received as completely as possible, because it will not come again. Then Michael came. The account names him, not an unspecified angel, not a nameless heavenly figure. Michael, the one who, in the understanding of this tradition, stands at the boundary between the human world and what lies beyond it. Who crosses when crossing is required? Who speaks when speaking is necessary? Who has been stationed at boundaries like this one? According to this tradition, since long before Seth arrived, he came to the gate and looked at Seth, and the account records that he understood immediately why Seth was there. Not because Seth's purpose was written plainly on his face, but because Michael had been at this gate since the day it closed, and Seth was not the first person who had come to it carrying this weight. The weight of someone who had traveled toward something because someone he loved was in pain, and he had been sent to find the answer to the pain. He spoke before Seth had finished composing what he intended to say. "Do not pray for this," he said. "Do not ask for the oil of mercy for your father. This is not the time for it. The time for it is not now. It is not soon. It is not any time measurable in the terms available to you from where you are standing." What Michael said next, the account preserves with a specificity that should be held as belonging to this tradition's way of imagining this scene, rather than as a single, authoritative account from a unified source. The exact accounting of when the oil of mercy would come varies across the different manuscript versions of this family of texts. Different versions give different numbers and different framings. The variation itself is the tradition's way of saying that the specific number is less important than the structure of what is being communicated, which is not yet, there is a not yet that is not the same thing as a no. He told Seth that the oil of mercy would come, that it was not permanently withheld, that the mercy it represented was real, a frame larger than Seth's lifetime, larger than the lifetimes of all the people Seth would ever know or know of. A frame that required a relationship to time that no human being standing at a gate with a dying father could easily maintain. Seth stood at the gate with this answer. He had come for oil and was being given time. He had come because his father was in pain and was being told that the address for that pain was located in a future so far forward. It was not expressible in terms his father or his mother or he himself would live to see. He had traveled to the edge of the closed world, and the answer he would be bringing back was not what he had been sent to find. The account does not record Seth arguing, does not record him pressing for a closer accounting or negotiating for something more immediately useful or asking whether there was anything that could be done in the meantime. Whether this is because the account understood Seth as capable of a particular quality of reception in the face of what could not be changed, or because the answer simply left no room for the kind of argument Seth might have wanted to make, is not something that can be determined from outside the text. What the account records is what happened before Seth turned to leave. He looked through the gate again. The second, looking. This is the detail the account holds with deliberate care. The first looking had been the arrival, the initial full attention receiving of what was visible through the gate by someone coming to a place for the first time and understanding they may not come again. The second looking was something different. It was the looking of someone who now knows something they did not know when they first looked, who has been told something that alters the frame through which what they are seeing is seen, and who looks again to see whether what they saw before looks different in the light of what they now know. The account does not tell us how it looked different. It records the looking and then records Seth turning and beginning the walk back. The not telling is its own kind of telling. It places in the hands of the listener the question of what it means to see a familiar thing differently in the light of what you have just been told about it. What changes when you look at the tree through the gate knowing that the not yet is real and is coming, but will not arrive in time for your father or your mother or you? What Seth carried back was not the oil. He carried back what he had seen. The light through the gate that was different from ordinary light. The tree. The first direct sight of the place his parents had come from, that any of their children had been given. Not described. not approximated through someone else's attempts at language. Seen directly, however briefly, from the edge of the boundary that separated what was from what had been. He carried back what Michael had said. The not yet, that was not a no. The promise, located in a future beyond any future available to anyone currently alive. Not comfort in any immediate sense. Not an address for the pain waiting at the end of the road back. But something. The difference between a wound that is simply permanent and a wound that exists inside a story still moving toward something. However slowly and however far forward, the something lies. He carried back the second look. The look taken at the tree and the light and the gate before turning for the road. The compression of what could not be carried in any other form into the seconds of that final looking. The fullness of what was seen held against the understanding that the seeing was ending and would not resume. The tradition trusts that you know what a last look is, what it contains, what it asks of the person taking it, how much it has to carry because it is the last. Seth turned toward the road. Behind him the gate held what it had always held. The tree continued in the place where it had always been. Without awareness of Seth's departure, without anything resembling the watching of someone go, Seth walked back toward his father, with the not yet that was not a no held in him, alongside the weight of the answer that was not the answer he had been sent to find. With the second look alongside the weight of his father's pain waiting at the end of the road, with something he had not had when he set out, which was not the oil, which was not the relief of the pain, which was also not nothing. The road led back. Seth walked it. Seth came back without the oil. Adam knew before Seth said a word, not from mystical perception, from the long practice of reading the world that 930 years of paying close attention to it produces. Something in the quality of Seth's walk, in the set of the shoulders before Seth was close enough for his expression to be readable. Something in the way Seth moved through the last distance between them that communicated the content before the mouth did. Adam had been looking carefully at things until they revealed themselves for 900 years. He had not lost that habit in the final weeks of his life. If anything, it had sharpened. The way certain things sharpen when the time available for them is running out, and the attention they receive becomes more complete because it knows it is among the last attention it will be given. He received what Seth told him, not easily. The account is clear that it was not easy. Not without the specific weight of a man who had sent his son toward the one possible address for the pain he was carrying, and was now hearing that the address was not accessible in time. But without collapse. There is a meaningful difference between those two things. Between not collapsing because you have stopped caring and not collapsing because you have been through enough to know that what remains after the worst news is still something. Still enough to continue with for whatever remains of the continuing. He asked for his children to be gathered, all of them, as many as could be reached in the time remaining. The children and the children's children and the generations beyond those. Not only the ones nearby, all of them, because what Adam had to give them could only be given in this form, in this presence, to the people it was intended for. Not written first and read later by people who had not been in the room. Given directly, in the old way, the way of someone who has lived long enough to understand the difference between what survives transmission through language and what can only travel directly from one person to another. In the room where the giving is happening, they gathered. They came from wherever they were and they gathered around him, and he looked at them. He looked at each of them with the same quality of attention he had described bringing to the garden. The long and careful and patient attention that finds what is specific about each thing it rests on. The attention, the attention that had named the living world and that had not stopped when the naming no longer produced the warmth it had produced inside the garden. He looked at his children and their children and the generations beyond those, and saw in each of them something of what had been built in the long years outside the gate. Something of the life made in a world that had not been designed for the people making it. By people who had kept making it anyway. He began to speak. not with the event in the garden. They knew the event. They had been born inside the story of it. He began with the place before the event. The garden as a place, not as the location of the decision that had shaped every subsequent moment. The garden as the actual experience of being inside it, the thing he wanted to give them before anything else. He said the light was different there. He let those 4 words sit without adding to them. Because the light being different was not a decorative detail or a poetic gesture. It was the most precise and honest thing he could say about what the garden had actually been like to be inside. The light was different in a way that encompassed everything else about the garden that had been different. Putting it simply, as a fact, without explanation, was the most honest way he knew, to give them what he wanted them to have before he could no longer give them anything. He described the naming. Of all the things he had done in the garden, the naming was the one he returned to when he was trying to give his children what the experience of being inside the garden had actually felt like. Not the abundance of it, not the ease. The naming, the act of looking at each living thing with enough attention to find the word that already belonged to it. And what that act had felt like from the inside, the quality of a mind in genuine contact with the world it was in, fully present, fully received. The specific experience of being the creature whose relationship to the world was through attention and language, and finding that the world met the attention and the language with something that could only be called recognition. He said, I looked at each creature until I found the word that fit it. The word was not something I invented. It was something already there, waiting in the creature. What I did was look long enough and carefully enough to see it. He paused. He said, I tried to keep doing that outside. In all the years outside, with everything I encountered, trying to look carefully enough to find what was already there. The word that fit. The specific and irreplaceable fact of each thing. He said it was never the same as inside, but it was also never nothing. He told them about Eve, not the moment in the garden, about her, the person she had been across 900 years of the life they had built together outside it. The specific quality of her presence over that long time, what she had brought to the work of learning a world they had not been made for, what he had learned from watching her do that work across 9 centuries of doing it. He said, she never pretended the weight was lighter than it was. In 900 years I never once saw her make the weight smaller than it was because the actual size of it was inconvenient or because making it smaller would have made things easier. She carried what it was. She said what it was, and she kept going anyway. He paused again. He said, remember that. Whatever else you carry away from this room, carry that. He told them about Seth's journey. He told them what Seth had seen at the gate. The light that was different from ordinary light. The tree visible through the boundary that separated what was from what had been. He told them what Michael had said. The not yet, that was not a no. The promise located in a future so far forward that no one currently living would be present to see it fulfilled. He was quiet for a moment after saying this. Then he said, I believe it is true. Not because the believing makes the pain I am in easier to carry right now. Because it does not make the pain easier. Not because I have evidence of the kind that makes believing simple and uncostly. I believe it because I have been alive for 930 years, and the one thing I have not been able to live without is the belief that the story is not finished when it feels most finished. That the closing of things is not the same as the ending of things. That not yet is genuinely different from no. He said, I want you to have that. Not my certainty about it. Because my certainty is not the kind that can be transferred from one person to another, and I would not want you to take it on those terms anyway. I want you to have the structure of it. The understanding that not yet is different from no. That the gate being closed is not the same as the gate never having existed or the oil never coming. He said, there is more I would give you if there were more time. There is always more. But what I have just said is the most important thing I know to say. Not yet is not no, and the not yet is real, and it is coming. He ran out of words eventually, not because there was nothing left worth saying, because the body had reached the point where sustaining speech required more effort than the body had left to offer. The stopping was not a conclusion the story had arrived at naturally. It was a requirement imposed from outside the story by the simple fact of what a body does when it is finishing. He closed his eyes. He opened them once more. He looked at the room full of the people who existed because he and Eve had stayed in the world outside the garden, who existed because they had done the next thing, and then the next thing, across 930 years of a world that had not been made for them. Each face in that room a specific and irreplaceable consequence of two people who had kept going. He looked at each of them. The looking was the last thing. Then he closed his eyes. The room was quieter than it had been a moment before. In the specific way, a room becomes quieter when something that has been present in it for a very long time is no longer present. Not the absence of sound, the presence of what the thing that was gone had been filling. Now empty, now available to be felt in its full shape for the first time, because the filling was no longer there to obscure the shape of it. Eve stayed. The children stayed. The account stays. She outlived him. The account does not give us a number, does not say how many days or months or years passed between his death and hers. Perhaps that is right. Perhaps the number would make into a fact what is better understood as a texture. The texture of being the person who remains after the person you have been alongside since before the world contained anyone else is gone. Every morning she woke into a world with the same physical shape it had carried through all the centuries of her life outside Eden. The same sky, the same ground, the same quality of light moving through whatever space she was in as the hours moved from east to west. But the one place in that world where the shape was wrong was not confined to any particular location. It was everywhere, because he had been in all of it with her, alongside all of it, and the everywhere of his former presence made the everywhere of his absence available to be felt in every direction she turned. She woke into that world for as long as she woke into any world. And then she called her children together, not when the grief had eased into something more manageable, not when she felt ready in any sense that the word ready implies a state of preparation that has been reached. She called them while the grief was still most fully present in her, most visible in the lines of her face and the quality of her stillness, most alive in her in the specific way that the most honest griefs are alive in the people carrying them. Without distance, without the protective softening that time eventually applies. She called them while she was most completely herself in the middle of it, because she understood, with the clarity that comes from having lived longer than anyone should be required to live, that grief of this kind does not resolve in the way that problems resolve. It changes. It becomes part of the structure of you rather than something you are carrying from the outside. It moves from being something that happens to you to being part of what you are made of now. But it does not resolve, and waiting for it to resolve before doing what needed to be done would have meant waiting until she was no longer able to do it. She gathered her children. She told them she was going to tell them what happened, not the version they already knew. They had all grown up inside a version of this story, had received it through the accumulated tellings across the years, shaped by repetition into something transmissible, with the smoothed edges that stories develop when they have been told many times in many different rooms by many different people. The full version, the one that included everything she still remembered in the order she still remembered it, with the details that had refused to be compressed across 9 centuries of carrying, the ones still as sharp and present in her as the day they entered her. Because some details resist compression, because they are embedded too deeply in the experience to come loose from it and travel forward in simplified form. She began with the garden, not with the event, with the place before the event. She said, "Let me tell you what it was actually like to be inside it. Not the story of it, not the version that begins with what went wrong. The experience of it, what it felt like to exist in a place that had been made for you. As much as I can give you, she tried to give them the garden, tried to find language for what it had been like to be inside, a world that knew you, the way only a place made specifically for you can know you. She had been working on that language for 900 years. She was closer to it now than she had been at the beginning. But she had never fully arrived, and she knew she never would. The experience was prior to language, older than the words available to describe it. But she tried, because the trying, even when it arrived at approximation rather than precision, gave them something they could not get from any other source. Then she went to the event, the way she always told it, directly, without the softening she had stopped applying to it several hundred years ago, when she understood that the softening was a form of not fully looking at what had happened, and that not fully looking at it was the one thing she owed the truth of it not to do. She told them about the approach, the patience of it, the observation before the speaking, the waiting for the right moment, the specific form the offer took. She told them what she had understood at the time and what she had not understood. She told them that she had been reasoning, that the choice had not been careless or impulsive or made in a state of confusion that removed her from the decision. She told them it had been wrong, not as performance, not as the practiced self-accusation of someone who has learned that flagellating themselves looks like honesty and uses that resemblance as its own kind of protection, simply as the fact that it was, the way a witness states what they saw. I chose, she said. I believed. I was wrong. She was quiet for a moment after saying those 3 sentences. Then she said, I am not giving you this so you will pity me. I am not giving you this so you will judge me. I am giving you this because those 3 sentences are the most useful thing I know. Useful because they are true. And truth is more useful than anything else I can offer you. She told them about the river, about the form that appeared on the bank and what it looked like and what it said and why she believed it. She told them this with the same directness she brought to everything else. And she told the part about why she believed it with particular care. She said, know the shape of your hope. Know it clearly and specifically. Because what comes for you will come in that shape. And the shape being exactly right is not sufficient evidence that the source is trustworthy. It is evidence that the source has been watching you long enough to know the shape. She told them about Abel, the dream, what she had seen in it, what she and Adam had done with what the dream gave them, how the thing had happened anyway. She told them that there is a kind of grief that arrives after warning, after action taken on the warning, after the action proves insufficient, that is different from grief that arrives without any warning, and that they should know about it, because knowing about it was the only preparation available for it. Knowing that it exists and has a specific texture and sits in a specific place was the only thing she could give them that would help them recognize it if it arrived for them. She told them about the long years, not in full detail. There was not time for full detail, and full detail was not what they needed most from her right now. She told them about the shape of those years, the weight and what grew alongside the weight, and the understanding that accumulated across 9 centuries of living in a world you were not made for. She said, it was not what I would have chosen. It was never what I would have chosen, and I could not have become who I became in any other way. I do not know what to do with that except to say it plainly and leave it with you. And then she came to the end of what there was to say. She had given them everything worth giving. Everything that had the kind of weight that justified the time it took to carry it across 900 years and set it down in front of the people she was leaving it with. She had given them the garden before the event, and the event itself, and the exile and the river, and the second deception, and the children, and the death of one of those children, and the long years and the death of Adam, and the texture of the mornings after. She had given them everything. And then she said, write this down, not as command, not as instruction carrying the force of authority, as the simple and clear expression of the one thing she needed to remain after she was gone. She had been carrying this story for 900 years. She had told it as many times as it had needed to be told. She had kept it as faithful as memory allows anything to be kept across 9 centuries of carrying, which is to say, imperfectly, but with genuine effort. Losing certain things, but holding the ones with the most weight. Write this down, so that it will still be here when I am not, so that the people who come after and who will need it, the same way you have needed it, will have it, so that what happened does not disappear with the last person who was present when it happened. Someone wrote it down. The exact chain of who wrote it first and who copied it next and who carried it across the border into the place where it had not been before is not recoverable now and was probably not fully recoverable even in the centuries when the first manuscripts we have were being made. What is recoverable is the result. Someone wrote it down, and then someone else copied what had been written, and then someone translated it, and then someone carried it. And then someone copied it again, then another, across 20 centuries. What you are hearing tonight is, in some real sense, the answer to her request. Generation after generation of people who found in what she had lived something worth preserving said yes, and wrote it down again. Eve sat with her children around her. The grief of Adam was still in the form where it was most present. The grief of Abel was there too, the way it had been there since the day it arrived. Part of the structure of her now. The grief of Eden was there, oldest of all the griefs, the one that had been with her longer than any of her children had been alive. All of it was present, and she sat in the presence of all of it without asking any of it to be other than it was, without performing a piece she did not have, without anything that was not the simple and complete fact of who she was and what she had lived and what she was leaving with the people she was leaving it with. Write this down. They did. The angels came down, not as metaphor, not in the way that the word angelic is sometimes borrowed from the literal and applied to experiences that felt transcendent or unusually significant. This account means what it says with the full weight of a cosmology, in which the boundary between what is above and what is below is real and is crossable in both directions. When what is happening on one side is significant enough to draw what lives on the other side across it. What was happening was this. The first man had died. The man who had been made before any other. The man whose existence had preceded every other human existence in the world. The man who had looked at every living thing and found its name, and had walked in the garden at the beginning, and had stood in the river, and had spoken to the stars, and had gathered his children at the end and told them what he knew. This man had stopped breathing in the world that had been his home for 930 years. This account imagines the event as large enough to draw a response from beyond the ordinary boundary. The angels came, and they prepared the body. This version of the tradition preserves this with the same care for specific detail that characterizes its approach throughout. Not the vague assertion that something sacred occurred or that the angels were present in some general sense. The specific work, the washing of the body, the preparation of it for return to the earth from which the tradition understood Adam to have been made, the wrapping, the tending, the slow and careful work of treating the body of the first man with the attention that body deserved. Eve was there. The children were there. The account places them as witnesses rather than as performers of this particular work. Present, attending, receiving what was being done on their behalf and on Adam's behalf by hands that were not human hands. Doing things that were completely and recognizably human in their form. The washing of the dead and the preparation of the body for burial are human things in the deepest sense. Not because human beings invented them or because they are unique to human beings, because they express something about what it means to care for what has been, about the dignity owed to the body that carried the person, about the refusal to simply leave what has been without the attention it deserves. The angels did them for Adam. They carried him to the place of burial. The location matters in this tradition in a way that exceeds what can be fully conveyed in a brief description. The place was not arbitrary. It was known by those who carried him with a kind of knowing that belongs to beings who have been present in the world since before the world had places in it, the way it now has places. The place where the earth that had been Adam's origin was close enough to what it had been that returning him to it felt like completion rather than only ending. Where the burial was a return, they laid him down. And then this account records the moment that stops a reader. God kissed Adam's face. Let those words be what they are before any movement toward interpretation. Some things need to be received before they are examined. Some things need to be let in before they are analyzed. This is one of those things. God kissed Adam's face. This is not in Genesis. This version of the ancient tradition preserves it. In the Greek manuscripts that carry this particular account, the account records it without commentary, without a sentence that follows explaining what it means or what the theological significance of the act is or how we are to understand it in the context of everything else the tradition says. It simply records it and moves forward, as though the act itself is the entirety of what needed to be said about it, as though any attempt to explain it would make it smaller rather than larger. There are things that explanation does not serve, things that become less when the apparatus of meaning is applied to them, that are reduced rather than illuminated by interpretation. The account understood this as one of those things. It responded by simply saying what happened and leaving the reader with it, what had been between them since before the gate closed. The relationship that had begun in the garden and had continued through the event and through the gate and through the 930 years of the world outside the garden. The relationship that had been changed by the event and had never been quite what it was before the event and had also never been simply broken or finished or reduced to the clean category of something over and done with. The relationship that Adam had addressed through the stars on the nights he stood under the sky with his words going upward into the darkness. This relationship arrived at the moment of completion in this form. Not in the form of the oil of mercy that Seth had gone to find and had not been given in time. Not in the form of restoration or reversal or return to the conditions that had existed before the event. In the form of this, kiss, the most immediate and personal gesture available to the account's imagination for what it wanted to say about what happened when the first man died and what that moment meant for what had existed between the first man and the source of everything. The angels stayed at the grave after. The account records this too. After the burial, after the kiss, after the specific work of laying the first man in the earth was complete, the angels remained, not the way the cherubim remained at the gate, which was a permanent station with a permanent purpose. These angels, after this burial, in the time that belongs to the space between something significant completing and the world resuming its ordinary movement, the time of acknowledgement, the pause that says, by simply being a pause, that what just happened deserves to be noted before anything else begins. Eve was there for all of it. She had been there for all of it from the very beginning. From the garden before the event, through the gate, through the first morning outside, through the river and the second deception, and the children and Abel, and the long years and Seth's journey, and the deathbed and the gathering and the end of Adam's breathing. Through all of it. And now this. She stood at the grave. The angels were still. The earth held what it had been given. She did not speak. Maybe after 900 years of finding language for things that resisted language. After all the telling and the retelling and the write this down, there was a moment where language was simply not the right instrument, where the most accurate thing was to stand, to let the standing be the whole of the expression, to let the weight of what had just completed rest in the air around it without being converted into words that would make it smaller than it was. She stood. The earth held Adam, and somewhere above them, further than the stars Adam had spoken to on the nights he stood under the sky with his words going upward, further than the gate that Seth had stood at the edge of, and looked through. The oil of mercy that had not arrived in time was still coming. Not yet, but not no. Seth looked east before he turned for home. The account does not record this the way it records the kiss at the grave, or the weeping on the bank of the Tigris, or the sound of Eve's voice saying, "Write this down." It records it the way that the truest things in this account tend to be recorded. Quickly, without commentary, trusting whoever receives it to hold it without being told what to hold it as. He looked east, toward where Eden was, in the direction of the gate he had stood at and looked through, in the direction of the light that was different from ordinary light, and the tree he had seen through the boundary, and Michael's answer, and the second look he had taken before turning. He looked east for a moment, and then he turned and walked in the other direction, back toward the road, back toward the life waiting to be continued. That is how this account ends, not with the oil arriving in time and the pain addressed, and the wound that had been open since the gate first closed, finally being closed from the other side of it. Not with any of the resolutions that the people inside this story would have chosen if choosing had been available to them. The account ends with a man looking in the direction of what is closed and then turning and walking away. And the text records neither what the turning costs him nor what it will ask of him in the years that follow. It records the turn, and then it is done. There is a kind of ending that closes. That brings questions to their answers and wounds to their healing and characters to the places the story was always moving them toward. Those endings exist. They happen sometimes in texts, and they happen sometimes in lives when the story happens to be the kind that arrives at that kind of destination. They are satisfying in the specific way that closures are satisfying. The way a sentence that has found its last word is satisfying. The way a door properly latched is satisfying. This account does not end that way. It ends with the grave fresh and Eve still standing, and Seth on the road home, and the oil of mercy somewhere in a future that no one in this story will live to see. It ends with the questions present that were present at the beginning, still alive, still unresolved in the sense that they cannot be resolved by anything a text can provide. What does it mean to live in a world you were not made for, and to live in it for 900 years, and to keep doing the next thing even when the next thing is very difficult, and the one after it gives no sign of being easier? What does it mean to carry the weight of a decision that cannot be undone, and to carry it not for a season, but for the entirety of a very long life, without the weight becoming light enough to stop noticing? What does it mean to send your son to the gate that has been closed since before he was born, and to receive back not what you sent him for, but something else? Not the oil, not the relief of the pain, but a sight and a promise, and a not yet. That is not a no. What does it mean to be the last one? The one who wakes up into the absence, and keeps waking up into it until the waking stops. This account raises all of those questions with great care and great patience across the hours of this night. And it ends without answering them. Not because it could not find answers, because it understood that these particular questions do not have answers in the sense of conclusions that bring them to rest. They have only the living of them, the long and specific and irreplaceable experience of being inside them, of doing the next thing anyway, and then the next thing, and then the one after that. Adam and Eve did the next thing for 930 years. Let that be what this account offers in place of resolution. Not a conclusion, but a duration. Not an ending, but a continuation. The evidence of 900 years of the next thing being done by two people who had every available reason to stop and who did not stop, who kept naming things in a world where the names landed differently than they had inside the garden, who kept speaking to the stars in a sky that did not speak back in the form they needed, who stood in cold rivers and were deceived a second time and lost a child and sent their son to a gate that did not open and built a life. A real and specific and irreplaceable life. In the world that was on the other side of the only world they had ever wanted to be in. They did not stop. That is what this family of texts has been saying across all the languages it traveled through and all the hands that chose to copy it again across 20 centuries. Not doctrine, not a theological system, not a cosmological argument. The record of two people given an impossible situation who stayed in it, who kept doing the next thing, who told the truth about what it cost and asked for the truth to be written down so it would survive them. And it did. And someone is in the dark right now listening to it. There is something this account wants you to understand about where you are at this moment. You are at the end of a very old story. A story that began with a gate closing and moved through hunger and rivers and stars and the death of a child, and a journey to a closed gate, and a kiss at a grave, and a man looking east before he turned for home. You have been inside this story long enough for the room you are in to have taken on something of the quality of the spaces this account has been moving through. The account does not ask you to resolve anything before you sleep. It has spent hours being honest about what carrying costs, and it would not be honest at the end to add to what you are carrying. It does not ask you to arrive at a conclusion about the kiss at the grave, or what Seth saw when he looked a second time before turning, or what the not yet, that is not a no, will look like when it finally arrives. What it offers instead is what it has been offering all night. Not answers. Company. Adam and Eve were outside the garden for 930 years, and they did not stop. They were wrong in ways that could not be undone, and they lived in the presence of that wrongness, and they did not stop. They lost a child and stood in cold rivers, and were deceived again, and sent their son to a gate that did not open, and watched him come back without what they sent him for, and they did not stop. They gathered their children and said the true things and said, "Write this down," and then they lay down in the earth they had come from. They did not stop. And someone 2,000 years later is in the dark, and the story found its way here, and you are the reason it kept being written down. Eve said, "Write this down." Here you are. Adam slept for the last time after 930 years. The earth held him. The angels stood at the place where he was laid. His name passed forward through every language this family of texts traveled into across 20 centuries. His name is still here. Eve slept not long after. She had said all the true things the last time they needed to be said. The children had what they needed. The grief was still most fully present in her. She lay down with it still present, because she had stopped long ago, waiting for grief to resolve before she allowed herself to rest. You do not need to wait for anything to resolve tonight. The oil of mercy is still coming. Not yet, but not no. You can sleep now.